A lot of the transhumanist stuff I've come across is actually quite human centered, even if it's not physical body. It's still how do humans evolve? How do humans become X, Y, and Z? So there's still a kind of sense of dominance going on, and that would be the antithesis of the Zoefuturism.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between or beyond. I'm your host, Edwin Rydberg, and today I'm here with Stephen Oram. Stephen is a leading voice in Zoefuturism and social science fiction, exploring the collision of messy humans and imperfect technologies. His work spans novels, an award-winning short story, and foresight fiction collaborations with scientists and institutions like King's College London. A former UK government head of policy, he's described by the Financial Times as a writer who should set the rest of us thinking. Stephen is based in the heart of central London and attributes much of the urban grittiness and the optimism about humanity in his writing to the noise, the bustle, and the diverse community of where he lives. Stephen Oram, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. Nice to see you.
So I guess the first thing I've got to ask is a UK government head of policy. Maybe walk me through what that was and what that involved, because I'm really interested in that type of thing.
So I stopped that about 3 years ago, but for the kind of 10 years leading into that, I worked in the Department for Education in the UK government. In the UK, that's devolved, so that's just for England. And towards the end of that, I headed up a team and we were looking at education above the age of 16. So, that may well be A levels, which lead into university. But the thing that I was particularly focused on was skills, and both the skills of young people who are training for jobs or whatever, but also for people who are retraining. And yeah, that was the kind of policy, and looking at how you help local economies plan for what's coming, rather than just skill people up for what's there. So it was in that area.
So my daughter's currently 17, working on her A levels, going to be taking them in May, June. So you might be someone who is directly involved in setting part of the curriculum for that, or the structure of the school system at that level.
If she's doing A levels, probably not.
Okay.
Had she have gone into some of the more vocational skills elements of that age group, then I would have been part of thinking about how to help that sector be able to train people and give people the skills they might need for jobs in 5 years time. So no, I can't take any credit or blame.
Or blame, yeah.
Now, if she doesn't go to university, if she goes on to do a much more sort of apprenticeship, vocational skills element thing, then I will have to accept some of the responsibility.
Darn, I was looking for a scapegoat there.
Yeah, not me.
Yeah, so I recall there because there was an introduction of things like, is it T levels and things like that, sort of with
Yeah.
respect to the trades directly.
I mean, I worked alongside people who were introducing T levels. The idea behind T levels, whatever people might think of it and whether it's successful or not, was to give the same status really as A levels. So technical levels, T being technical, I think was the original idea. And you study those. There were already curriculum and exams in place for that, but it was quite notable that when A level results come out, up until not many years ago, all the press, all the media would only be about A levels and universities. And partly that was because until T levels arrived, exam results around the other exams, the more technical ones, came out at different dates for different boards and all that kind of stuff. So it was a way of trying to make technical skills as an equivalent to academic pursuits.
And I mean, even now the media does still cover the A levels,
Yeah,
primarily.
working on skills really crystallized for me how much class there still is in our system, in our culture in the UK.
Yeah, it's interesting because my daughter is realizing that we do sort of, because my wife's a doctor, but we live a fairly modest life. We don't have a big house or anything. We live in sort of lower middle class part of town. But so she is sort of aware, and we've always tried to introduce these kind of ideas to her, to be aware of that kind of thing. And she realized, like, her own school, how classist some of her classmates are.
Right.
Even just they have certain expectations, and she's just like, and then she meets other people through her sports or something, and they just have a different lifestyle. It's really interesting that yeah, that it's sort of ingrained into
That's,
certain
yeah.
segments of society. Yeah. What I'm curious about for this, because this, you said you finished around 2023, so that was more or less the end of the previous government. But what I was wondering, that's also crucially the time when generative AI was introduced. I'm wondering if that influenced the thinking on the T levels and sort of boosting them up more because, we have this uncertainty on what AI is going to do for certain higher level jobs. Whereas it does seem reasonable to expect that the trades will be around and survive this wave much more robustly. So did that enter the thinking at all?
So I left 2022. So generative AI wasn't really in the mix particularly. Obviously, people knew about it to an extent. AI was definitely in the mix in a very broad sense, as were life sciences and some other things. I think the thing that there's a real danger when you're doing that sort of stuff at a national level that you kind of you pick on one or two emerging industries or emerging things, and you then kind of that's what you want to develop. But of course, that's only relevant to certain parts of the country. So the thing that I was involved in was actually going out to local areas and basically putting in their hands what they thought their local economy was going to look like. Some had AI in it, some had, improving the wine industry, for instance.
Okay.
It was very varied. I'm still in touch with some people. It's definitely more prevalent now in people's thinking, and also the use of it within policy making and basic running a big bureaucracy. So it's kind of there. But I think I left probably just before that really became widely known.
And if you were giving advice to someone finishing high school now about jobs to look at that were sort of future proof, at least when we say that, we're probably thinking like 10 to 20 years, what kind of things would you suggest?
Yeah, it's always an interesting question. And one, so I'm going to slightly avoid answering that. So as somebody who has never really had a career plan in mind at all, but has managed to work in jobs that I've really enjoyed and never been bored, I think my advice is kind of do things that are interesting to you and think carefully and develop the skills that are about being able to adapt, being able to kind of look at a blank bit of page and come up with something, and just those sorts of things. But I still maintain that you get one life, so if you can, I know this is not possible for everybody, so but if possible, pursue things that are gonna at least put food on the table, but are gonna be enjoyable, because otherwise, like, what's the point?
Yeah. So
If you
kind
have
of a flexible mindset and develop skills that are broadly adaptable to the workplace.
Yeah, I think so. And be prepared to, yeah, as you say, be flexible, and that, which is really poor advice in terms of, I think, over the last, when I was that age and thinking about work as much as I did, which wasn't a lot. I think we've moved over the last 40 years, it feels to me, into a much more transactional kind of culture, and paying for education as well at universities, student loans as it is in the UK and all the rest of it, I think has kind of shifted people more into that. Okay, what do I need to do in order to progress a career? And I completely get it, because it's not not as financially secure now as it was when I was that age. If
Yeah,
that's
I think it's interesting because I mean, when I was going through university was the time was the last time that things were really starting to change. That was sort of the dot-com kind of boom. But we had some career discussions which were revolving around how you had to be more flexible in the workplace. The workplace was moving from being like on a train to being like on a bus to being like on a all-terrain vehicle driving wherever you want, more or less. And it didn't quite reach it at that point. But I think ironically a little bit now it more or less is, or potentially could be. But the kids, like you said, because of the reasons you mentioned, feel like everything has to be structured.
yeah.
And I think they're almost at opposition with the reality in some ways, which is it's a little bit frightening, but I guess everyone learns through their own life, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Chat GPT and things like that. A lot of the tech, whether it's dating apps or various other things, recommendations and stuff, kind of give us the impression that there's a right answer for you.
Right.
It's kind of interesting how that, as you say, is kind of at odds with the reality of what that tech's actually doing to lives, particularly around jobs. But by its very nature, is kind of pushing the idea that you can be structured and there is an answer, and so long as the algorithm is working properly, here you go, here's your life.
Yeah.
It's an interesting dynamic that's going on, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm gonna, I guess, put you on a spot again. I did this for David in the last episode as well because so he was in Sweden, I'm Canadian inherently, and we're in the UK. And these are three of the countries that have dropped significantly out of in the top 30 on the quality of life index, with Canada unfortunately dropping the most of the three. And you're in the heart of the country, basically in London. And I'm just wondering, first of all, I guess, what changes have you seen in London? Is it as bad as sometimes we hear? I mean, I do enjoy parts of London, going to London. So from that perspective. And then I was wondering on your thoughts on the sort of present and future of England. And let's keep it to the near future because obviously none of us have a giant crystal ball.
Yeah, wow. What have I seen change? So gentrification is an obvious one. I've lived in the area I'm in now for 30 years. That has definitely gentrified, sort of, in that a lot of new buildings have gone up, a lot of new flats, expensive flats, and empty flats. You hear quite a bit about London being a bit of a investment for overseas money, and I think it doesn't seem that people are that bothered about whether anyone's actually living in the flats they've bought or not. That it's a way of investing. Prices will go up, probably. They do tend to, particularly where I am, which is the kind of West End of London. And is London as dangerous as people say? Well, I go all over and it doesn't feel any more dangerous. If anything, when I was living over in East London, sort of mid to late 80s, it was a lot more dangerous there then. I did hear the other day that something like 40% of phone thefts in the world are in London,
Okay, so that part
which
might be
is,
true then.
so that might be true. Apparently, I mean, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I was told that there's a well-established trade in kind of black market phones between London and countries where phones are locked down and people are tracked through them. So some of the kind of less open countries. I don't know if that's true. I don't know anyone who's had their phone nicked, and I haven't had my phone stolen, and I'm not that careful. So, I don't know. It doesn't feel that much more dangerous. Where's the UK going now? That is a really
Yeah,
interesting.
especially considering our place in the world is what I'm thinking as well. You know, the geopolitical rearrangements we're seeing now in this time period. How do you see England and the UK's
Yeah,
position in the world?
it's a really tricky one. So leaving the EU was obviously big. Trying to find the UK, trying to find its place in the kind of world on the borders of the EU, but not part of it, I think is still unfolding, basically. A few years ago, I would have said it's the kind of death throes of an empire and trying to come to terms with the fact that it no longer, the UK and Britain no longer is that empire. no longer has the same kind of standing that it's had in the past. So the hopeful part of me is that actually the UK gets its head around that it gets a good sense of its place. It encourages its creativeness. It makes use of what is inherently core to the culture and the kind of multiculturalism that we've got and all the rest of it. I think there's a lot there to be optimistic about if we can kind of shift our mindset in the right way. Pessimistic side of me is we on that same trajectory that we become more and more isolated, have a rosy view of the 1950s or whatever it is, and kind of get into some weird place. And I think in the UK you can kind of see that playing out between the Green Party with the new leader Zach Polanski and Reform with Nigel Farage. You know, they're the two kind of extremes in the populist way of politics that are kind of playing out those tensions. So the last novel that I released, called We're Not Anonymous, did have Britain divided into three areas and focuses on two, and how those two different ways of thinking and community is and what government is, how that might affect. So yeah, so I don't know, is that
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because I do agree with definitely one part there that stood out was, the idea of if we could use the potential effectively, we can move forward well into the future. And I think this speaks to kind of the issue that Canada has had as well, is we've never been able to fully mobilize our potential. I think we end up not putting proper systems in place, or maybe it's just too big of a country and people just end up going to the United States, right?
right?
So we just have the massive brain drain and we never end up building. And I think there's in the case of Canada, it's possibly some kind of, national attitude as well, which wouldn't be the problem in England in the same way. But maybe, like you said, maybe in England, it's clinging to the glory days of the empire and not evolving into whatever should be coming next.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, it was interesting coming back to the policy stuff. The When you've got kind of universities, some of the top end universities doing a lot of blue sky stuff, really innovative, early kind of research and development, we don't have an economy, we don't have a structure that can pick that up and turn it into something that makes money.
Right.
That IP and all that goes elsewhere, and that was part of what the kind of question, if you like, the policy question was around. But having said that, I had a document from I think it was the 1860s, which said, so an internal government document, which said, we really must fix our skill system. And Prussia seems to have got it right. So, it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, well, speaking of foreign countries, then it does seem like we're probably sending everything over to China at some point. Bring them over here, train them, and then we send them back with all the ideas.
Yeah,
But
and other countries that have
yeah.
an entrepreneur. I don't know. There's something not quite working there.
Yeah, yeah. We won't go too much further into that, but we could spend a lot of time on it. It is interesting that you say you're in the heart of London and you mentioned specifically King's College. Now, that is one of the colleges my daughter's applying to. So we were down there a couple months ago in that area. And so you attribute much of the urban grittiness and the optimism about humanity to sort of your view of writing and how it comes across. Now, there was an interesting contrast because my daughter and I, so we stayed in that sort of area, Euston Station kind of area. So we visited UCL and then King's College. And there was quite a contrast because obviously we went up to Camden Market. And so you can imagine sort of going north of that road, you just get into this really vibrant, bustling community, and especially Camden Market itself, not just Camden Town. But then you come south of that line towards King's College and you end up in a really sort of sterile, well, I'll just call it sterile environment. And it's really a sharp contrast, isn't it? And it's only, I don't know, 5 blocks, maybe
Yeah.
5 to 10 blocks.
Yeah, I mean, I live just south of Euston Road, so I'm closer to Camden than I am King's College London. So
Kind of right on the
I'm
border. Yeah.
basically UCL is on my doorstep. So that's kind of where I am, near the which is the BT Tower. I don't know if you saw that when you were down there.
Didn't
Very
ring a bell, but I'll look for it next time.
famously, when it was the post office tower in the 70s, I think it wasn't on any maps because it was deemed to be a national secret. But anyhow, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, down towards King's College London, where you're down on the Strand, it is kind of, it's very touristy. It's very, as you say, it's not Camden Market. I think where I am, less and less so as time goes on, but there's a good mix of people that kind of, not Camden Market, but the mix that you get in Camden that comes south, as you say, towards Euston, does spill over a bit into it. But the other thing I think is really interesting about London is people do travel quite long distances to meet up with friends. So you go to other parts of London, and so I think it's a very vibrant city, but there are aspects of it that are not residential and are kind of touristy and studenty.
So living in London must give you access to, I think you've mentioned too, you're interested in applied science fiction. It must give you access to a lot of scientists that you could go and talk to as well, because you mentioned the link to King's College, as I brought up before as well. So do you actually have a good connection there?
Yeah, definitely. So the applied science fiction, where I work with scientists, technologists who generally are sort of researchers and developers. If they're in academia, they have to do a kind of ethics and public engagement strand about their work. And the applied science fiction, I write bespoke short pieces of fiction that we then use with the scientists in public forums to discuss what the science they're doing. And the story element really helps people engage who are not experts in that particular science, and depersonalizes everything a bit for both the scientists and the public that you're kind of communicating with. And it is absolutely glorious. I mean, King's College London, which is where I do quite a lot of stuff through, because the person I do it with, Christina Cardy, is based there. But we're just doing one in the area I live in Fitzrovia. And we're doing it with the community, with people who live and work here, and with people who think about the future. And we've got 3 universities on our doorstep in the area: UCL, Westminster, Birkbeck. So to be able to find people in the centre of London who are doing stuff that's really interesting and is absolutely fantastic. And usually I find once you've got 1 or 2 links into a university, then people spread the word, and you can kind of find the people that you need and that are interesting. So that's a very long answer to your question, but yes, is the short answer.
And is that sort of where the interest in Zoefuturism came from? And just to define that for any listeners, because I had not heard of it before. I'm sure many people haven't. So I looked it up. It says a conceptual framework and an emerging subgenre within science fiction that emphasizes connectedness, engagement, relationality, and constant becoming of life. And this includes our relationships with technology and things like that. And so did that all sort of come about from this collaborations then?
No, it didn't, funnily enough.
Okay.
I'm not surprised you haven't heard of it. It is emerging, probably even more than saying it's new. There's somebody called Yen Ui who I have collaborated with on a couple of things. We were having a coffee. She was telling me about something in her PhD where she'd coined this phrase, Zoefuturism. So it's very much her thinking. Comes from a couple of years ago, a professor whose name I'm going to remember, Roger Amos, coined the phrase zoetology, and Jens kind of applied this across the science fiction. But yeah, basically it kind of recognizes there's no sort of still moments in life, in nature, in the cosmos. Everything's changing in relation to its surroundings. That includes us humans. Everything is kind of becoming and in relationship. And I was talking to Yen about this. The British Sci-Fi Association has a critical journal called Vector, and the next 2 issues, me and Yen are guest editing, and we've got articles from all sorts of different perspectives around it. So it's emerging as a subgenre. I think it's really interesting because it's counter to everything is defined. It's counter to sort of colonialism. It's counter to domination. It's Taoism. I mean, I'm not versed in this stuff, which is why Yen wanted to work with me. It's because like I can bring a perspective to this that she wouldn't see because she's brought up in that kind of culture. So yeah, it's a fascinating way of looking at life, and then thinking about that in terms of science fiction becomes quite interesting.
And we'll touch back on that when we get to your story in a short time. I did look you up before this, and it seems like you were in the newspaper industry for quite a while.
No,
Is
that's
that
another
that's
Stephen
another
Oram.
one? Okay.
Nothing to do with me at all.
That's interesting. There's two people in
There's
the
also a bishop called Stephen Oram who was cleared of sex offences. That's not me either.
So have you thought of changing your pen name then?
Well, interesting, I use Stephen because there's also a famous actor and writer of kind of drama called Steve Oram. So yeah, I didn't do enough searching, obviously, before.
It's difficult though. There's so many people, so many similar names. That is not one I'd pick to have a lot of people with, but interesting. So how did you get into science fiction writing then?
So I haven't been doing it very long. Sort of, it must be probably about 13 years now. It came from a moment where the person I live with, married to, was pointing out that my life tended to be partying and working. And there would come a point where I would stop working, and just partying was not something that she was particularly keen on. And also at the time I really wanted to do something creative. So, I've worked in bureaucracies most of my life, and whilst that's a form of creativity, it's not what I was looking for. So I kind of thought about, do I change jobs? Do I try and get into some career that's more creative? And I tried a few things out. I tried painting and I was absolutely rubbish. I tried photography and I was okay, but other people seem to be able to take better photos in a tenth of the time it took me. So I was like, okay, it's kind of interesting, but I don't think it's my gift. And then I went on a 10 evening, once a week course at City Lit on creative writing, and I just loved it. And from then kind of built up writing. So that's how I got into it. And so I don't know why science fiction, I guess. So there's not been a passion particularly, but I don't know. I kind of got into it, and that's what came out. So it must have been in there somewhere.
Do you think it maybe comes from an interest in futurism at all, or is that a relatively new thing?
I think it probably comes, yeah, from, as you say, from futurism, from thinking, could things be different? How might that look? And a really big interest in social, as in society kind of stuff. So I think, doing policy work or the sort of jobs I've been in were all kind of about having some effect on how society structure or operates. So I think my science fiction tends to be much more about society than the technology, although a lot of it does include technology, and the applied science fiction does as well. But yeah, so I think you can kind of see those things coming together. I'd been a programmer, computer programmer at the beginning of my career, so I kind of understood tech as well. So I think those things come together and you kind of inevitably get some form of science fiction rather than historical fiction or romance.
Right. So you have three novels now and a number of anthologies, if I'm not mistaken, that you've.
I've got the three novels, two of which were kind of 10 years ago. It took me a long time to write the third one. And short stories, partly I think short stories, I first started writing short stories because I kept getting great ideas while I was writing the second novel, Fluence. And and quite inexperienced, I found myself shoehorning in these bright ideas into a novel where they didn't exist. So an editor that I was working with kind of encouraged me to write short stories. And actually, I think it's a good way of developing your writing. I quite like writing short stories. So I've got 3 collections of short stories, got a few published in magazines and things like that. And then, yeah, I've co-edited 4 anthologies, very much around that applied science fiction element.
So at what point when you started writing did you decide that you were going to try and publish some of your work?
So I wrote, the first novel I wrote was called Quantum Confessions. I wrote without, I didn't know that I could write. Can I write? I don't know. I'd done this course. So I wrote what was actually 40,000 words, sent it off to some critiquing services that basically said, this is good. It needs to be twice as long. Please don't give up writing because you seem to have a talent for it. So that was encouraging. So I, went through the usual, I doubled the size of the book, went through editing, got editors involved and all the rest of it as one does. I learned by trying things. So very naively, probably, I through a company called Silverwood, who it's a assisted publishing kind of company. I was very taken with them because a friend had submitted a novel to them and they basically turned it down and said, although we don't take any rights and it's all your rights, this is not ready enough for it to have our badge on it. So yeah, I published it really just to see what the reaction was. So within a couple of years of starting to write, before I was writing short stories, actually. Yeah.
With the latest story, which we'll get into shortly with some of the themes and details, you've published that with Little Factory, which is founded by my guest from the last episode, David Ulfeld. How did you discover them and find the fit for your story?
So what was lovely about that was he was working with somebody and they recommended him contacting me or got in touch with me and said, I've been talking to David and I think it'd be a good match. So we were kind of put together by a third party. I sent David some of my work that was already done, some short stories that were already published, and he basically responded by saying, I really like your writing, like the style, a bit too near future and too human centered for what I'm looking for. Would you be up for writing something that's not as near future and not as human centered? And it happened at the same time that I was getting interested in shifting my writing and trying to be a bit less literal, because the applied sci-fi can be very literal because that's the job. Yeah. All those things sort of came together, and at the same time I was thinking about Zoefuturism. So it was one of those moments that just really came together well.
Oh, and how have you sort of found working with David and Little Factory?
Absolutely brilliant. I'm not just saying that because I published my novella. So an amazing attention to detail right from the word go, amazing enthusiasm, but also getting editors, good editors in and helping shape it. And to be honest, giving me the space, me and the story, the space to exist in the way that it needed to. So kind of, yeah, it's been very, very supportive, and I think the approach and that kind of relationship and having conversations over this sort of Zoom and things like that has really helped that. So it's not been the classic, we're open for submission, send something, yes or no. It's been much more interactive than that, which has really suited this particular story, I think, and where I was at the time.
I had a good discussion with David about the whole sort of forming of the company and the landscape thereabouts in the publishing industry on the last episode. But what I'm curious is, because it is largely short stories, novellas that they're publishing almost exclusively. And like you say, very high quality work, both in terms of the stories and the production quality of the books. but it's a difficult sell because it's a shorter piece of work. So what I'm wondering is, I'm just curious, as someone now who's in this, you read a lot of short stories, novellas, and some novels as well. How would you like to see the publishing and reading landscapes evolve, or how would you, let's say, hope they might evolve to sort of support more creative projects like this?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think there's a number of ways to look at that, but I've been thinking a lot, and people have asked me around, the introduction of using generative AI to create stories and all the rest of it. And I wonder whether there's some link here with the way David's gone about this, making it very high quality, collectible, makes the artifact itself very attractive. And I'm not suggesting that all writing should go into a kind of very expensive collectible, but I do wonder whether what I'd really like to see is a sort of badging of anything that's done through generative AI, badged as such. And if people want to buy really, really cheap, sort of very obvious novels, we had Mills and Boon at one point, which was all done to formula, then let people know that and they can. So I'm kind of hoping that the craft of writing and the experience of reading something that you are reading something a human has put effort into, and you, from your own perspective, taking from that in the knowledge that it's another human and all the rest of it, hoping that becomes more significant maybe than it is now, rather than everything trying to compete in a kind of cheap pile 'em high, get them out the door way. Because I just don't see that as a kind of model that's good for anyone unless they're big publishing house, famous authors, celebrities, or AI generated stuff. That's the kind of pile 'em high.
It's interesting because I do see the generative AI creating not really a schism, but a change in the publishing landscape and potentially the reading landscape. Like you say, and this across art and across writing and everything, with bespoke works and high quality crafted works almost being like a collector's series.
Mm.
And then one thing with generative AI that I've been thinking of in terms of writing, and maybe any tech-minded people who are entrepreneurial might want to look into this, but like you say, the sort of cheap Mills and Boon type stuff, you can, and there's a huge fan fiction segment of the reading and writing landscape at the moment, and you could see these being combined such that you craft a story, but you have the ability with generative AI to modify it based on what the reader wants. So with the fan fiction self inserts and things like that, right? You can put whatever characters you want in the place
Yeah.
of the protagonist and antagonist. You could see that being, like you say, the sort of Mills and Boon level. We're going to get in trouble for disparaging them, maybe, but
Yeah.
you know what I
Well,
mean?
I mean, it's
Very successful.
yeah, very successful, and it's, I used to go out with somebody who was really into, it's easy reading, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, but it's different to some other stuff. I mean, there's obviously a middle ground somewhere, and that's probably I worry about that middle ground stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It'll be interesting to see what that middle ground is because we've sort of just discussed the two ends, but
Yeah.
the middle will be curious.
Yeah.
And you have then started your own, well, let's say you have nudged the future fiction publishing for your book. Are you I'm curious the direction because it sounds like you might be hoping to publish other people under that, or is it just a vehicle for your own work?
It's just a vehicle for my work. I really don't want to publish other people's work
Okay. All right.
for all sorts of reasons. Just about every part of that is something I don't want to do. So no. I mean, basically, so with the novel We're Not Anonymous, it was getting some interest, but it wasn't mainstream commercial enough to get picked up very quickly. It was getting out of date. I mean, part of the reason it took so long for it to come out was it was going through the kind of agent waiting and all that kind of stuff. And rather than doing it through Silverwood, by that point, I kind of bit the bullet and thought, actually, I'm getting somebody to typeset it. People are editing. I'm getting cover designers. So it's only really the putting it out on the platforms and the metadata that I'm not doing,
Yeah.
that I need to do. So, and I've been using Nudge the Future Fiction previously. So when I did the applied sci-fi, I've been using that because the notion of Nudge the Future is kind of what I was into. I remember really, really distinctly standing on a beach, looking out to sea, kind of going, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do about this novel? What am I going to do?" And the revelation that actually bundling up the applied sci-fi work, which pays, and some other stuff that pays, and taking a risk on a novel that may or may not pay. I was like, actually, I all of this could be within one business model, and therefore I don't have to see everything separate. And how much will this return on the investment and all that kind of stuff? I can see me as a kind of business model, everything I'm doing, and that was what led to more formally. I mean, it's not that formal, has a website of sorts, but yeah, that was where that came from. But no, I don't have any interest in becoming a publisher as such.
Yeah, it just struck me that that is an excellent vehicle for relating to the applied science fiction, obviously, given the name and everything and the subject. And it's interesting because I just want to drop this. The blurb from your book brought to mind a short story idea I had myself, I think in the pre-COVID era. I never developed it because I don't know London very well, but it literally had this similar idea of a flooded London and a kind of, mysterious plot going on. And I don't know, there's something about a flooded London that speaks to the science fiction person.
I mean, it may be the same about any big city that's on a very dominant river, but I mean, we've got the Thames Barrier there to stop London flooding. There's huge parts of London that are built on marshland that well, I mean, if you read some Charles Dickens, very soon after crossing to the south of London, I can't quite remember, he's in marshland. There's probably something in the psyche around London which is actually there's quite a bit of it that's been captured from the river that could well come back.
Yeah, I mean, New Orleans had the levees obviously as well, but
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
most of southern England seems to be on a floodplain, so
Yeah, and
would
the
be
east of England
interesting.
is really
Yeah.
there was a website I used for We Are Not Anonymous, which you can set the rise in the sea level, and it shows you where is flood. It's a world map, so you could kind of see if it went up by this much, which bits of London, which bits of the east of England. Basically, live in Wales, I think, is the answer.
Yeah, and I think I probably use the same map for a story I was developing as
Yeah,
well, set a couple hundred years in the future. And I noticed that so I'm up here in North Yorkshire, and I noticed there's like a triangle up here with Leeds in the bottom point and everything moving up into Scotland, and that whole area is relatively safe as well.
yeah.
But York would be an archipelago basically. So
In fact, some of the story in We Are Not Anonymous is set. So a lot of it's set in Lincolnshire, which is subject to flooding. And the way I divide England is it kind of it's just above North York where the dividing line is sort of level with Scarborough. Yeah.
no. Well, we'll see. I mean, maybe your company will draw some attention and you'll hire people to turn it into an applied science fiction publishing house or something. We can check back in a year or so.
Yeah, I'll eat my words.
How have you found marketing the work? That's always a challenge. Like you say, you have the applied science fiction that directly has a link, but your own fiction, have you spent much time marketing it?
I think my marketing's a bit sporadic, I think is probably so it's not I'm kind of interested, but it's not something that captivates me. So I have to make an effort to do it. I think the applied sci-fi, I do a lot of talks, all that sort of thing has kind of raised me as a kind of my profile. So that obviously that helps. But when you head towards more of the sales end of the marketing, I probably don't do it brilliantly, but I probably do what an awful lot of people do, is run some adverts. It's been a lot easier since I've been in control of some of the stuff, because before it was quite costly to change blurb or change the price, because basically I was paying somebody else to do it. And now I can do that. I've been playing around, experimenting much more over the last few months with that kind of thing and promoting. But yeah, it's okay. But I wouldn't. I talk to other people who are really on this, and that seems to be their main focus. Also, I don't write trilogies. I'm not. It seems to me that you need a book that you can almost give away, that gets people hooked on the second book and the third
Yeah.
book, and
Mhm.
it's it, to do that would kind of go against what interests me. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
But today, I guess we're going to be talking gradually, finally, perhaps, about Brain Fruit, which is a novella that's been published by Little Factory. I usually try to give a brief synopsis. I feel I might get this wrong, so I'm not 100% sure. But it's basically this. So in the blurb, it does spill out a bunch of things, so I can't get too far wrong, I guess. But there's a bee that nurtures what's called the brain fruit, and they form more or less symbiotic. Is that the right word? Maybe with a bug as well. So they form what they call a trioid.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we can get into some of the details on how you envision that. The story is in a similar way to what David's story was about an AI, was ultimately about loneliness. Your story is this, feels to me, cyberganic world almost, but it's ultimately about relationships, which feeds into the Zoefuturism. That's probably as much as I dare summarize. So if you want to add anything to that, feel free.
I think, I mean, I've deliberately, even writing the blurb, I've deliberately left it open to interpretation in terms of what these things look like and how they might function and what the story is. Because as you say, I think it's much more, it's a story that is about trust, that's about developing trust, about compromise, but that kind of gradual development of trust. And trust isn't a kind of binary thing. It's not like, I don't trust you, now I do. You know, as we know, you build trust across time. As also you said, which is quite right, that on the Zoe futurism thing, it has an element of always becoming. There's a theme of change, both in that sense of trust, but also in terms of lifespan of different elements of that trioid, and the knowledge that some parts will live longer than other parts and will form a symbiotic relationship with the next generation of one part of it. And so I was really trying to play around with that, at the same time absolutely fascinated with human brain organoids. And there's something called Oscar, which I came across years ago, which is it's a kind of, it's built from cells, I think, but you kind of clip it together, so it has a sort of functioning, not functioning heart. It has something that kind of pumps things around. It has legs. Can't quite remember, but it was this idea of being able, almost like a Lego, a living Lego creature, where you kind of plug bits together, and how they might work. So those two things together made me. That was one bit behind the story, and then the other was this notion of learning to trust and seeing the kind of ongoing nature of life.
So you mentioned this came from the discussion with David about a short story for Little Factory. So, I mean, you've just described sort of the elements that came together for the story, but what was it that's inspired you to come up with this particular story and bring these elements together? Like, where was that sort of brain spark that, if you can
Yeah.
recall still?
So I think already in my mind, I wanted to do and have done stuff about human brain organoids. So that was already there, and the Oscar thing was already there. So these were things that were kind of in my brain. I want to do something with these, not thinking about them together necessarily. And then David kind of pushing for something less human and less near future. kind of lent into that. And what happened was I went away on my own, which I do once a year, to seaside resort in December, I think it was, or November, so quite bleak. I remember spending maybe 2, possibly 3 days just walking up and down the beach, letting this idea settle. So it wasn't, it's not so much a spark as a kind of slow smoldering fire or something. So yeah, it was, and then the actual arc of the story kind of came after that, but just allowing myself to think of these things and not kind of go, that's it, I'm going to do that.
The Google AI told me that the core themes of Zoefuturism, it explores humanity's interconnected relationships with each other, nature, environments, technology, and the cosmos. And your story does seem to capture pretty much all of those relationships. It is definitely a non-human one that's, I mean, there's hints of humanity, but it's definitely one of those things that sort of makes you go, what's going on here? You capture the relationships sort of, let's say, within our circle, and then the potentially hostile relationships or the ones that we need to negotiate with, let's say, relationship with nature, the relationship with the technological, and then, as you mentioned, also the connection between time as well, past, present, future, and you have sort of entities that sort of can recall the past and sort of pass that on. So when you were writing this, we do talk about pantsers and plotters. Now, I'm curious how, like, what the process was for developing this story, because you mentioned sort of how you came up with the ideas. Did the story itself kind of have that blending process as well as you were developing, or was it sort of I think on it for a while and then I know what's happening and I just can go from there?
No, I think and this tends to be typical for me as well, is I kind of have an idea of the arc of the story, but then kind of think about what's the next scene, if you like, and allow, again, with no sort of time pressure, allow the space and the time to decide whether or not that is the way I want the story to go. So I mean, after the okay, this is the what I want to do with this story, I then spend a bit of time thinking about the different, let's call them creatures for the want of a better word, in it, trying to get a sense of what they would be like, and how they would view the world, and then the story. But it was a kind of semi plan that is held incredibly loosely. Is probably the best way of describing how I work.
It struck me with this story that it could actually be a continuation of David's story in a way, and without giving an ending to David's story, spoiling that one either. But I guess it depends on how you interpret the trioid completely as well. But they do kind of link up in that's an interesting way, because I don't think that was intended, I assume.
Not at all. I hadn't
Um,
read David's when I wrote this, so no. Not
did you envision this? Tell me if this is spoilers, and we can sort of not go through this way. But did you envision this as a kind of cyber organic ecosystem? That's kind of the way I came away with feeling that sort of technology had been deeply integrated into the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, into the whole ecosystem, I'm not sure if I did. I think it was more so it's definitely cyber organic kind of stuff, absolutely, and symbiotic things. And so I think probably what was driving this was the idea of a far futurish situation where humans have disappeared, but their legacy is still there, and therefore the technology that exists as humans disappear, and the symbiotic nature of technology and nature, which is sort of part of probably where we're going, or certainly a possibility of where we're going, what would that look like? So not a sort of over the top tech eco culture kind of thing, but remnants of something from that kind of development of biotech, or whatever you want to call it. and that just to add to that, that might be me retrospectively looking at the story. It's one of those that I held it quite loosely. I gave it space and was I felt very comfortable to not even know entirely myself. Partly it's quite short, so that helps with if you're doing a novel, you kind of got to know a lot more about things. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess that retrospective interpretation is common to all great art, isn't it?
And I think also there is the kind of, a story belongs to a reader as soon as it's out. And it was very interesting so David got two editors involved who had very, very different styles. It was interesting with both of them, the conversations I had with them around how much should be described and how much shouldn't. And I think the first draft of it, there wasn't quite enough described for people to get enough of a grip. But I certainly didn't want to go as far as certainly one of the editors was keen on going. So I'm like, no, I want that to be ambiguous. That's deliberate.
You can see that. I mean, one of the things that science fiction can do that a lot of other genres can't is leave a lot of things to the imagination to be filled
Yeah.
in. But yeah, you do have to have enough of a baseline to build on. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you got for what the story was to be, I think you got the balance right. There will definitely be some readers, I think, who maybe want more. There is that question of how exactly does this work? I had to go back and read it a few times.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of fair enough. But then, yeah, my response to that would be that's short enough for people to kind of hold it in their head enough to try and work it out. There are certain things, as you know, that you have to make some assumptions in order to work out how this might work.
Because ultimately we have the interesting world building that goes on and the entities within the story, and they need to work together ultimately for their survival. So it's about relationships fundamentally. I found it interesting as well because you do play a little bit, I think, I'm assuming intentionally, but you can tell me otherwise. So you have the trioid relationship and you describe sort of how that builds. And it's probably, I'm assuming, evolved over some time so that maybe each of the components are kind of used to this process. But it could be interpreted as, let's say, manipulative by the ultimate mind that's running the trioid. And then when something similar is, like, let's say, approached by another entity in regards to that trioid, it resists, right? So I took away from this, and maybe this is just my reading into it, but I took away an interesting dichotomy of it's happy to do that to its own components within the framework of what it's used to, but in a new framework, it resists what is effectively the same structure, just an expansion of that structure. And that probably sounds very vague, but
Yeah.
any more is going to be spoilers. So was that intentionally built? And you know what I'm talking about, I
I
assume.
think I know what you're talking
Yeah.
about. I think it still plays on that element of trust and the building up of relationship and the time that takes. And to an extent, I think you're right. The whole kind of we've been around this before, not us, but those of us who came before us, or bits of us have been through this before, so we've got a bit of a head start there. What is this? This is kind of, this other thing's a bit more alien and all the rest of it. I think the bit that I was really consciously playing around with there was, what does compromise with something that is not, that you are not going to become symbiotic with, you are not going to be fully trusting and engaged with, what does compromise look like? And I on NetGalley, it got pretty much its only like really low starred review that it's got. But the person who wrote it, I was so pleased, because they were like, this should not be read by anybody. Like, I am not compromising with this type of person, this type of person, this is dangerous to suggest we should. This should never be seen in the outside world. This is, this is well written and all the rest of it, but absolutely the message of this is I cannot support this. And I was just really pleased that they'd understood what I was trying to say, and it had got such an emotion, it got such a reaction. This has worked, even if you don't agree with it. So yeah, I think, but as I say, that bit I think is looking at the difference between building trust and compromising without trust.
Yeah, and even those people are part of the relationship environment we have to navigate, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That brings me back to touch briefly on Zoefuturism again, because you mentioned you mentioned very quickly in passing a hint of Taoism, but it made me think when I was reading the description of could you call Zoefuturism a kind of techno-Buddhism in a way?
I think so. This is where I go. I think Yen would say that it's not really about technology. I mean, it is
Right.
science fiction, but it's
I mean,
much.
ultimately relationships.
It's
Yeah.
ultimately, and the organic and the non-organic and the human and the non-human and relationships. So I don't think she would put, like, she's very clear. It's not political. It's not. So which is odd given that we're putting it in the science fiction.
Yeah, it's almost impossible not
category.
to be considered some kind of political ideology these days.
But it's that sense of, uh, it's a worldview. It's a way of looking at the world rather than, as you say, sort of a tech Taoism
Yeah,
or.
I suppose the reason I suggested techno-Buddhism is because, I mean, we already have Buddhism, which is fundamentally a relationship viewpoint. I mean, this depends on which version of Buddhism, I guess, you look at. But the one that I tend to think of is ultimately a view of the relationship that we have and are with the environment, the universe, etc. So you wouldn't actually need a Zoe futurism term if it was just like standard Buddhism or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I think that the so the kind of the situating it in science fiction, maybe speculative fiction would be slightly broader, obviously, and a bit better. But the the technology and everything that comes with that genre is also part of the relationship as well. So I think, and in the vector stuff that's coming out in January, we've got people who've written articles, and why is this not solar punk? Why is this not Throughtopia? Why is this? And I think that notion that every nothing settles, everything is in
Mm.
change. So you're not, how do we get from A to B, or what does our utopia at B look like? It's so, and I think technology and science and all the futurism stuff is part of that. I guess the reason I'm kind of slightly resisting tech Buddhism is it kind of focuses in too much on tech, I think.
Something I was wondering in this regard as well, because we talked about Buddhism, which has at least three variants, and it seems like no ideology or belief structure survives for long without schisming into other various variants, right? I mean, obviously Christianity fractured fairly quickly, as in Buddhism and most other ones. Scientology, we've seen the fracturing of that only started this last century, and it's fractured already into a couple forms. It would seem like this is I don't want to call it a belief system necessarily, but I'd say a view of reality that is prone to fracturing as well in some ways. You know, as I just suggested, there's the various aspects of it, and each one of those aspects could be highlighted. For example, the technological relationship with humans. And it made me wonder if transhumanism could be a natural progress of Zoe futurism, or, for example, an evil hijacking of it in a way.
It might depend what version of transhumanism we're thinking. I mean, I think it definitely is something that doesn't put humans at the center of everything. So in that kind of whether that's transhumanism or post-humanism or whatever. I think there's probably more openings towards that stuff by thinking in this way. A lot of well, this is a very personal view, and it's a very broad sweeping statement. A lot of the transhumanist stuff I've come across is actually quite human centered, even if it's not physical body. It's still, how do humans evolve? How do humans become X, Y, and Z? So there's still a kind of sense of dominance going on, and that would be the antithesis of the Zoefuturism.
So I'm curious. We'll get into one last topic here, and then the big question. But your story is set on what it could be Earth. It could be an extraterrestrial planet. I'm a bit concerned that there's a movement in science fiction that has developed over like the last 10 years or so that says humanity should not settle any extraterrestrial worlds because we will contaminate them and we should let them grow themselves. Now, this relates to relationships, which is why I'm bringing it up. Because I kind of view this as a simplistic view of life in the galaxy. I think I see it as viewing life planet by planet rather than viewing life over the galactic system or even the universal system. And especially if we look at discoveries of the building blocks of life on asteroids in deep space and things like that, you can almost envision them, and it has been suggested, as seeds bringing the components of life to planets, which I would then view as an egg, for example. So then life moving from planet to planet could be like the equivalent of bees cross-pollinating other planets. I mean, what was your perspective on this? Because this does tie into relationships as well, and thinking of, whether we think of very close relationships and we favor like in the trioid, let's say you over favor the trioid relationship and didn't want to develop the broader relationships or the broader perspective within the natural ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, so my starting point would be, I don't think the human race is civilized enough yet to be let loose, to be honest. Like we can't kind of sort out the one we're on. So I have a kind of a bit of an aversion to let's go into space. It's like, hold on a minute. Like we don't have a good history of colonization and all the rest of it. So that would be a starting point. If we did manage to do that and get ourselves sorted and all the rest of it, then I'm not, I don't have any strong views particularly. I think like life is life, and we are part of that, and we're part of nature and all the rest of it. And if life through our activity moves around the galaxy in a particular way, then that's, to me, that's kind of, well, that's what's happening. So they may seem like contradictory statements, but it's like, I don't think it's a problem that we do that, but it is a problem if 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 we're in the kind of mindset that we seem to be currently in as a species.
All right. Do you think, I mean, life is ultimately messy, and so it's an interesting perspective because it's not uncommon, shall we say. Let's sort ourselves out here first,
Yeah.
or at least try to before we get destroyed by the next giant asteroid. But do you think it's a little bit contradictory also to what we were talking about earlier? So as an individual going out into life, like let's say we're an adolescent going into our life, you can try to get everything together and to plan everything, but then life's going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at you and you're not going to be ready for it anyway. And you just kind of got to learn on the fly. In a way, is that not the same here? Like we're probably never going to be at that stage where we feel like that we're ready to go out into the universe as a adult, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. But if we're doing that analogy, if you've got a adolescent that is continually beating up and bullying and generally being quite a nasty piece of work, you wouldn't put them in certain situations. I don't know. Yeah, it's breaking down the analogy, but no, you never like, yes, as a species, we're never going to feel we're ready to do that. I'm just I suppose what I'm rallying against is maybe it's the escapism that comes out of some sci-fi, but also comes out of some of the kind of tech billionaires that almost have kind of gone, well, this isn't working, so let's off planet and go somewhere else. When we do have the resources to fix starvation and poverty and all the rest of it. So there's an element of me which is just like, we're kind of looking in the wrong direction. But I do completely agree with you that yeah, you make things up as you go, and hopefully in a good way.
Yeah, I kind of have the view that a lot of people don't share this necessarily, but if you're familiar with the mouse utopia experiment, which I brought up on the show a few times before in the late 60s, early 70s, basically what they did was they put it was mice and rats in different experiments. They put them in enclosures, clean, watered constantly, and ample food, lots of space. They started them out with a small group of 4 males, 4 females, and then they wanted to sort of see how the mouse society worked, basically. And what they found was, well, in many ways, what we're seeing now within our own society. Keep in mind, this was an enclosed facility, so the mice couldn't just run off wherever but they had everything they wanted, but it was enclosed. So obviously parallels to where we are. And they found that the colony died out it's about a third of the way to its maximum possible size. And it died out simply not by disease or anything like that. It just stopped breeding. They started fighting each other. The males started fighting each other. The females started killing off their own children, and they just stopped breeding. And my interpretation, now there's been many interpretations, but I feel like the main interpretation is that there was no purpose to this colony anymore, right? It had nowhere to go. And I feel like that's what's happening ultimately on Earth, and that's what will happen more and more as we move to the future. Now, this is probably me just soapboxing here, so but feel free to add your thoughts. But it feels to me like we need, as a species, somewhere to go to continue and even possibly to fix the issues, right? Because the issues will potentially continue to get worse if we don't have anywhere to go. The society collapses and then we restart from small groups, which can then grow in the same pattern ultimately, and probably accomplish the same thing again. But
I mean, and actually, I have heard of that. I just didn't know what his name was, but I think so. I would challenge the notion that we currently have colony, the Earth, where all humans have everything they need.
yeah, fair enough.
We're far from that.
But there is nowhere to go, is what my point is. Like there's nowhere else for anyone on the planet to go now that isn't already spoken for. So you reach the point where the well-off societies then turn on themselves because we're trying to fix all the injustices that, got us to where we are. Meanwhile, the poor societies are not actually benefiting from any of this because they're being ignored largely. And no one has any new territory that they can move into to build the future. So I'd love the idea you described where, if we had the technology where whoever wanted to could just speed off and find a place somewhere and try and build a life in the future, I think that would go a long way to easing some of this strain as well. But I mean, it's obviously a complex subject.
Yeah, I need to think about it a lot. Instinctively, I don't agree, but I know that I tend to start from the most optimistic point of view and almost deliberately naive. So the idea of a human population kind of decreasing a bit, that we become comfortable with people moving around the planet, so the number of people living in certain areas is sort of right for that area, suggesting that a huge sway, whole countries get wiped out by some climate thing, and that's good because there's less humans. I'm kind of like, we know that the richer societies get, the less they reproduce. We know in some countries it's turning into a real problem. Even in countries that are quite anti-migration, they have an aging population. It's a problem. If that kind of worldview could be shifted, then I think we're in a different situation. And I mean, to get off planet and all that, it's quite, although actually somebody who knows about this stuff disagreed with me on that. It seems to me that it's quite an expensive thing, and you put a lot of resource into working out how to do that when you could put resource into other things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a clear argument. You
Yeah,
could, probably end all the poverty in Africa with one billionaire's assets, more or less.
yeah.
Um, but I mean, we'll move on here because it is a complex subject. I know there's going to be listeners who will agree, and there's probably a larger number of listeners who will take your side because that's the majority that I usually hear. But I would suggest that typically it is young males who are the ones who want to venture forward into the unknown territory. And I would suggest that that's big reason why so many of them are going into video games these days. Now there's many ways to interpret that whole process, but I suspect that a part of it at least is video games provide another avenue, another way of developing yourself that takes you out of the main society, right? Which seems to be full. And that's the way I'll sort of look at it. And so like if virtual reality ever gets to that level that it's actually interesting, that would probably be the next one. Also, if they really pushed a lot of effort into settling in undersea colonies, that would quite likely be another one as well. So some other frontiers, and I think the digital one is another frontier as well. But I think there's a lot of evidence from my perspective, but I know that there are a lot of these, and these are two competing ideas, because if I'm right and we don't go off planet, then we are going to collapse or go extinct. But if you're right and we go off planet and it's a whole huge horrible mess, that's also pretty bad.
We've got a bigger mess.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, and as you say, it's a really long and complicated conversation because, what is it? To what extent is it the socializing and expectation of young men that makes them feel they are only validated if they push forward into kind of more physical frontiers, whether it's virtual reality or physical, but as opposed to pushing into more empathic kind of frontiers, or so I think I don't know, is this testosterone based or not, or is this expectation and social, I mean,
I
these
think
are
it's ultimately
questions.
mating related, isn't it? There's certain mating instincts built into us that we use. You can see this on the female side as well, and the women do, well, females, girls, and women do factor into this equation as well. We've only been talking about the male side, but I do feel like it's part of when society's full. It's easier, let's say, to prove yourself mate worthy by conquering another, let's say we'll use that phrase, conquering another area, environment, undiscovered territory, rather than trying to work your way through the overfilled current society in a way, which actually is stagnant, right? Because it's not fully stagnant, but it feels like it's stagnant when we have all these billionaires sort of controlling everything, right? And we constantly tell people, oh, there's no future for you. You're never going to own a house and things like this.
Yeah, I mean, I realize I have a particular perspective because I kind of dropped out for quite a long time, but I've never been interested in females that saw that as a kind of
But
attractive thing about Apollo.
not intentionally, but I mean, it might have been there. I mean, you did have a non-standard path, it sounds like, through
Yeah,
life. Like I didn't consciously do that either, but I did go overseas in my studies and did sort of go into other parts of the world and things like that. I wasn't looking
yeah.
for a partner,
That,
but
okay, yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, doing stuff that makes you interesting, I guess, is different to the notion of conquering. So
yeah, I
maybe
mean,
it's just language
that's a
around it.
triggering
But it's
phrase, but
yeah,
I did use it, yeah,
yeah,
with knowing that.
yeah.
But so anyway,
Forgive me well.
So I think we'll leave that question there. We'll just touch on the big question here and then give you a chance to plug your stuff. Your story is set in a post-organic, I will say, not fully post-organic, but post-organic intelligence world. So the organic intelligences that were there seem to be gone, at least, either left or died. So the first part, I guess, is do you think, I guess maybe coming off of what we were just talking about, do you think machine intelligence might be the future for our world?
I don't. I think the machines as and of themselves, I don't think will take over as an intelligence. I think if they are, let's say they get to a point where there's no more training material, and I'm not sure that the development. I suspect the development will be a downward spiral rather than an upward spiral. That they'll kind of eat their own tails, so to speak. But I do think a kind of human machine, not necessarily physically integrated, but I think if we can work, well, I think we'll end up working together. So there's things that our machines they'll get better and better and better at, and we'll understand what that is, and which is kind of just what's happened over thousands of years, really. But it's a bit more accelerated and a bit more extreme. So no, I don't think machine intelligence will take over.
I just had a kind of negative, pessimistic view. So what you're describing triggered a thought of the Matrix and a particular version of working together, combined with the idea that, the AI data centers, like you say, as they grow, they require an exponential amount of data and also larger and larger amounts of energy, all of which was dealt with in the Matrix, basically.
Yeah,
And that was a way of, quote, working together
yeah,
in a way.
yeah. Fair enough. I mean, partly, I mean, the machines in AI. I mean, I don't know where it's going to go, obviously, but it kind of doesn't quite work properly, does it? So
No, but they're still going to try and make it, aren't they? I mean, they're
yeah.
building data centers everywhere, farmland in the US and all over England. We're paying for it through our electricity bills. They're trying to make something work, whatever the heck it is. I don't know.
Oh, but I mean, there's a lot of talk about an AI bubble bursting and all the rest of it. And what I find really interesting. So I was at a symposium last week of researchers and developers mainly at King's College London, who are looking at using AI in terms of understanding spoken word. That might be what the emotion is behind it, or whether it's an indication of a particular mental condition and all that kind of stuff. And they are just so far off anything. And there are people selling this stuff apparently, but it kind of doesn't work. So what we see as the hype and actually behind the scenes, it's all very interesting, but it's a long, long way off being.
Yeah, I wonder if it's like one paradigm shift away, for example. I wrote a blog post a couple years ago coming from a biological perspective into the technological, but using the model of how a biological system, an intelligent biological system, the requirements it has for creating that self-aware intelligence and how we could potentially structure machines and to create such a system. So I do wonder if we're simply a paradigm shift away.
Yeah, I mean, if where you're sort of going with that, I'm not sure, but if where you're going is the kind of more biological computing.
So not so much biological, but building the machines to mimic the. So what I'm thinking is, if you look at a body, we've got senses. So I looked at it as three levels. You kind of have all the various senses coming in for the life support. You've got life support structures, you've got mobility structures, you've got sensory structures, all this kind of stuff, management of fuel, etc. If you put that down as a base layer, and then you feed that into a management system, which would be the subconscious mind, which manages that with the primary goal of survival of the entity. And then what you add on to that for the final layer is the third layer, which is the, let's say, temporal goals, right? The temporal part of the brain, temporal lobes. You give it larger goals that span a greater amount of time. And then you have basically all the systems you need from mimicking the biological entity. It wouldn't be like us necessarily, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be self-aware. And so that's kind of where I came from it on that.
Yeah, I can't put a coherent argument together. I I guess there's something in me which, and again, this might be coming back to the optimism, that there is so much we don't understand about ourselves. We don't understand how, yeah, let's call it consciousness or whatever. We don't understand, there's an awful lot we don't understand, and therefore couldn't replicate, but also I I I I would be skeptical that putting together a functional entity would lead to what we might call self-aware or consciousness and all the rest of it. That's not to say it wouldn't be fully functional and be able to inhabit a world and all the rest of it. I presume I guess we just wouldn't have any, as humans, we wouldn't have any clue what it felt like to be that. In the same way we don't really understand what it feels like to be each other, let alone anything else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of talk about AI. This is the last part, and I know you have a particular perspective on this already, as you've mentioned. So you can probably get out of this one easily if you want. But let's say if machine intelligence is possible, or if AI advances to the point where it makes us largely irrelevant. What I'm wondering is, like, from this point forward, we're on this cusp of a changing society. Some have called it the singularity, for example, the technological singularity. Are we doomed? I know you're an optimist. So what I'm thinking is, because we have a couple of possibilities. So machine intelligence takes over and we fade into irrelevance and eventual extinction. We resist the machine intelligence, the development of it further, but we're unable to manage the big data because to advance from this point on, we really need a big data management abilities for science, especially for technology, for development, engineering. And so our societies collapse. With regards to the birth rates, where it's pretty much suggested it's going to collapse starting around the mid-century anyway. And the other option is we blend with the machine, as we talked about earlier, become one, and what was humanity becomes irrelevant. So in either of those three scenarios, we are kind of done as humans. So are we doomed? You can bring your optimist view to this one.
I don't think we are doomed, because I think what is more likely to happen is that we get beyond the kind of hype of various bits to do with machines and all the rest of it. I think we will get to a point where we can really cleverly use those machines. I think, I mean, I've written stories, and I think, you can kind of see how you might link up a human brain to a machine and that interface. But I would see that as a particular, maybe a peculiar part of what's going on and not the norm. It's for a particular purpose or whatever. Again, coming back to human brain organizers, I'm kind of interested in that. Yeah, I don't think we're doomed at all. I think we'll kind of get on top of this, and we'll make some really good advances around, whether that's around diseases or biotech. There's stuff that we can't even imagine we'll discover how to do through the technology, but I personally don't see it as blending. But I won't be around when it happens. But
It might happen faster than you think
maybe.
if Elon Musk is going at it and
Well, yeah,
Peter Thiel.
yeah. I don't do online banking yet, so
Oh, there you go. You sound more of an optimist than me, but I think we do agree on some things that it is going to definitely open up avenues and ideas that we haven't considered yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, that's why it's important. And I think sci-fi is really good at this, and the applied sci-fi is why I do it, and all the rest of it is, let's open up our imaginations to all sorts of possibilities. I'm not particularly bothered about predicting. I'm much more interested in opening up the imagination so that we can at least have conversations and think about all the kind of things that might happen. And kind of, as people say, you tend to play when you're young so that you're prepared for the real thing when it happens later. I that's the kind of bit that interests me. So
Yeah, that's my interest too, which is why we have alternate futures.
indeed.
So on that positive note, then, it's been great chatting with you. Unfortunately, that's all our time for today. Before you go, perhaps you can just let us know if you have anything in the works, where we might find you online, and if you'll be at any upcoming events, or maybe you've got some stuff at King's College you're going to again or something.
So things in the pipeline are things that are still in the writing. So there's nothing just about to come out that I can think of, but I have a website, stephenoram.net, that will keep that up to date, and a Substack as well. There's links from there to the Substack. So the Substack tends to be where I put things out. Started doing a podcast, a very short 10-minute thing with somebody called Robin Ryback, who's in New York. So we're kind of thinking about the future and data and from our different perspectives. So that's just started.
What's the name of the podcast then?
It's called Our Data, Our Futures. But what we're doing is it's a very kind of low key thing. So we're basically recording it and then putting it out as videos from our own Substacks. I'm at Nudge the Future on Substack. I mean, it's all on the website. The stuff about Zoefuturism will come out in January for people who are British Sci-Fi Association members in Vector, but also some of that stuff will be available on the website. And then anyone who's interested in applied science fiction, myself and Christina Carday from King's, we're giving a talk at the RSA in London, which is both online and in person. Again, on the website, there's an events tab that lists the kind of places that I'm going to be at.
That's excellent. Stephen Oram, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been fascinating. Some good conversations there.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.